Good evening. You're on the smoking section with Stephen Helfer. Welcome. Welcome anybody who wants to give me a call. I always like to get calls. Help me do the program. Before I forget tonight, I'd like to say thank you to Wayne Robinson, who is filling in as cablecaster tonight. Wayne has been a stalwart CCTV Be Live producer and has a show We Live with Wayne every Thursday at 3 p.m. And I think Wayne has been doing these shows for an awfully long time, as have I. So just a thank you to Wayne for cablecasting tonight and doing such an excellent job. Our normal cablecaster, Ella Greeley, is away in California, I think, to celebrate Thanksgiving. A lot of us in the smokers' rights movement have been waiting for something, for the other shoe to fall for a long time. And it will, I think, fall beginning probably, I'm trying to think, it's either already fallen in some places or it will fall this Sunday, and that is something called corrective statements by the tobacco industry. And, you know, these are statements that have been forced upon the tobacco industry by a court, by a judge, a Clinton-appointed judge, Gladys Kessler, who presided over a case that was brought against the tobacco industry by the Clinton administration Justice Department. And this was about, I think the case ended in 2006 or so, but it accused, of course, the tobacco industry of all kinds of things. And it was announced by President Clinton towards the end of his office. And it was very convenient that the Clinton administration, Department of Justice, brought this against the tobacco companies, and the judge who presided over it was a Clinton appointee also. The Justice Department wanted the tobacco companies to pay all kinds of huge monies, you know, but I believe that was thrown out by the judge, so I have to give her credit for that. But the tobacco companies have been forced into making these kinds of confessions. And these confessions are called corrective statements. I think the term corrective statement, it's somewhat like the Truth Campaign, which is brought about by the Legacy Foundation on tobacco. I think anybody who calls its campaign the Truth Campaign, I think that should set off a red flag. One's skepticism should be raised to its fullest level. And these corrective statements that the tobacco companies will be making in newspapers and television are anything but corrective. I would say deceptive, forced deception on the American public by a court of law, by the Clinton Department of Justice, and by anti-smoking activists. So I think really they are deceptive statements, not corrective statements. And many of the issues that they deal with, I have dealt with before here on this program, but for lack of anything better to talk about, I will address again. And one of the statements, it's probably the most misleading. It's hard to find one that's the most misleading because they're all misleading, if not absolute lies, is that smoking kills 480,000 people a year in the United States. Now, first of all, those aren't real people. There is no such thing as a death certificate that says died by smoking. Death certificates say you die from heart disease, cancer, or stroke if you die of natural causes. The causes of your heart disease, your cancer, or your stroke are very, very difficult to determine. But the way the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention counts it, if one of my grandfathers who didn't smoke died at 85 of a heart attack, and my other grandfather, and he died of 85, and he was a smoker, they both died at the same age of exactly the same disease, but one was a smoker and one was a non-smoker, then the smoker died because he smoked. Similarly, if someone is 300 pounds, has hepatitis C, is an alcoholic, and smokes, and that person dies, that is someone who is killed by smoking. And that is the way the statistics are made to promote anti-smoking hysteria. Well, someone once did an analysis of this figure that was released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this 480,000, and it was a person who worked, I think, for the National Institutes of Health at one time, so she was an expert in statistical analyses. And she determined that even if you took these deaths at face value, that they were in fact caused by smoking, and again, these are not real people, this is what we call a computer model that's based on one assumption: if this, then that, then this, then that, then blank. And you know, if you feed it, the computer, the right data, or the data that you want to feed it, you can come up with anything you want. But she looked at this and she said, even if you took these at face value and you analyzed them carefully, you found that the vast majority of these deaths occur after the age of 72. And many of them, a significant number of them, occur at the age of 85 or later. So these deaths that are supposedly caused by smoking very often, most often, occur to elderly people or very elderly people. And the reason I mention that is because, and here is the most deceptive part about it, is they always like to say these deaths are more than AIDS, suicide, murder, drugs, car crashes, and alcohol combined. But these deaths are all occurring to elderly people, people who, even if they did not smoke, would be expected to begin dying. And AIDS, suicide, drugs, especially car crashes, occur to people in their 20s and their teens and their 30s. So, for example, no teenager dies of smoking, but plenty of them die in car crashes. Plenty of them die from suicide or murder. Some die from alcohol. We hear about especially pledges in fraternities. So this whole idea of comparing and saying that more people die from smoking than AIDS, murder, suicide, car crashes, alcohol, etc., is a deliberate way to use numbers to forward the anti-smoking agenda, and it is deliberately and very carefully deceptive. And so when this statement is made, in fact, in this case by the tobacco companies, it is not a corrective statement by any means. Again, it is a deceptive statement which the tobacco companies are being forced to do by a Clinton-appointed judge who was acting on the behest of the Clinton administration's Department of Justice. So I think, if that isn't enough red flags for anybody, I don't know what is. But one thing that's important to recognize is that, there are a lot of people out there. I meet people who tell me they believe nothing the government says, nothing the president says, nothing the national security advisor says. Everything is, they hold up, that this is probably somehow deceptive or misleading. But if the Surgeon General says it, or the CDC says it, and if it's anti-tobacco, all of a sudden they believe it. And part of the reason I think they believe it is because we live in a time where corporations, and most notably the tobacco corporations, are held in such low esteem. And I think the reason the tobacco companies are held in such low esteem has nothing to do with their behavior. It has only to do with a brilliantly but unscrupulous and insidious public relations campaign against them. And for example, the tobacco companies are accused of misleading the public. But I have followed this issue pretty carefully since 1965, really since 1967, let's say. So that is 50 years. Only one time in that long period have I ever seen anything from the tobacco companies that was aimed at the public, which even disputed any of the claims against it. I have seen tobacco companies defend themselves in court. I've seen some letters to the editor written by tobacco scientists employed by the tobacco companies. But this whole thing about tobacco companies deceiving the public, where did it come from? Where were the tobacco companies attempting to deceive the public? I challenge anybody to produce an advertisement or something that was on television, something in the newspapers, etc., where the tobacco companies said that they disputed this. This was all done in courts and stuff. So this idea that they deceived the public is nonsense, and I challenge anyone to look for it to find it. Well, another area, of course, where the tobacco companies are being coerced into making these confessions, and I think there's nothing like that. These confessions remind me of more than certain show trials that were taken, that took place in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, where all of a sudden a lot of top communist officials were getting up and confessing to all kinds of things that really, to anybody in the world, were nonsensical, and then they were immediately executed. And they were coerced into these confessions. And so I think the coercion that's being brought against the tobacco companies is very similar to that. One of the things is the lack of health benefits in low-tar cigarettes or in natural cigarettes. Now, I have never seen a study that has been done on natural cigarettes. I have never heard of a study. So how can you say that natural cigarettes are not safer if you have never done a study on them? There is no scientific basis to saying that. I don't know if they are safer or not safer. But for the tobacco companies to say that natural cigarettes, those without any kind of pesticide, that are made with organic tobacco and there are no additives in the cigarettes, for them to be forced to say that these are not healthier than cigarettes that are made from pesticide tobacco, tobacco that has additives in it, should be based on some kind of scientific evidence. I have not heard of any. And I think that's an interesting point. And of course, as I've talked about on the program before, the whole reason that tobacco companies introduced low-tar cigarettes was, again, because they were pressured to by public health officials. And they did this for years, the tobacco companies. And even in the early days, certain tests, studies that were done on them by anti-smoking advocates said that these were better, that these were safer cigarettes. And then 20 years later, the anti-smokers changed their mind and said, well, people are really, they're smoking these in a different way, so they're not healthier. And then the tobacco companies, having been forced into making them, were accused of somehow deceiving the public again. I mean, this stuff is all propaganda. It's all widely spread and, unfortunately, very widely believed. Because if you repeat it over and over again, and in newspapers and whatnot that people trust, the public again begins to believe it. And as I've mentioned it before, one reason that I often have a discussion with Paul Neff about this is one reason that newspapers are inclined, that the news media is inclined to run with this story is because it's such a good story. Tobacco is this horrible, horrible thing. It's a pandemic. It's killing people. This makes a story that people want to read. This sells newspapers. And I'm not saying that journalists deliberately lie, but they're inclined to write and publish that material, that news, which excites the public, the latest crisis. And so that is one of the reasons that news organizations have jumped on this bandwagon, this anti-tobacco bandwagon. Now I'm going to take a little pause today, and I'm going to go to the Smoker of the Week. And tonight I have a very special smoker, and this is from an article in the Boston Globe, quite a few years back, but I think it's still interesting, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. Let's see if I can get my Smoker of the Week up. Here we go. We're working, we hear at CCTV, this is not exactly public television. We don't have all of that stuff, and here we go. And here is my Smoker of the Week, and this smoker's name is Justin Hoover, and he is here testifying to I think a Senate committee of Democrats, and this was in 1996, and Justin was testifying how he started smoking at the age of 6, and he became addicted at the age of 9, and he was exhorting senators to crack down on tobacco. And again, this was 1996. Justin Hoover from Des Moines, Iowa, brought to Washington, and he's told the senators, I hope you guys can help my brother and sister so they don't start smoking. He also mentioned that he thought he wanted the government to make it harder to steal. So here we have a 12-year-old boy. I recently looked up on Facebook, and I found Justin, and I messaged him, asking him how he was doing, but he did not respond, so I can't give you an update on him. But he is my smoker of the week. Started at 6 and got addicted supposedly at 9. Obviously, I'll tell you honestly, I think using children this way to forward a political agenda, I think is a form of child abuse. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that he was brought to Washington, coached what to say, and he's not 18, and he's being used by anti-smoking zealots to influence public policy, and I think that's despicable, to use children as pawns. But as I say, I messaged him on Facebook and did not get a response. It would be kind of funny if he was a smokers' rights activist. I should probably email him again and find out. Well, let's see, what else do we have here about this, these so-called corrective statements, which are really deceptive statements that the tobacco companies have been forced into making. Then they talk about the addictiveness of smoking and nicotine. Well, first of all, if you go online and you do any research on nicotine, you will find that it is almost impossible to get animals addicted to nicotine. So while you might say smoking is addictive, certainly to say that nicotine is addictive, there is no evidence for that, and there's a good evidence to the contrary. Animal researchers can never get anybody, can never get animals addicted to nicotine. And then when you talk about smoking being addictive, as I say, the word addiction is so broadly used it can really cover anything. I was once at a talk by a former director of the National Institute for, I think it's called drug abuse or drug and alcohol abuse. And I asked him, I said, is there any substance or behavior that human beings cannot become addicted to? And he said, well, at one time he would have said, yes, there are such things. But at the point when I spoke to him, which is about 15 years ago, he said, no, I think, you can become addicted to anything. So if you can become addicted to anything, it really doesn't mean much. And certainly millions upon millions upon millions of Americans have quit smoking, and they've quit smoking without any professional help, and without resorting to any kind of medication. And when they quit smoking, rather than writhing on the floor or having the shakes or getting into cold sweats, they've had 3 or 4 days of irritability and difficulty concentrating. But this word addiction, to apply it to smoking is really a stretch. It's been done, and it is done, and most people say, oh yes, tobacco is addictive. But, when you can give something up and, go to work the next day and function just fine, except you're a little irritable and you have a few, you're not easy to concentrate, those withdrawal symptoms are so minor. In fact, I think they're probably more minor than coffee. I know that many people, when they give up coffee, or stop drinking even for a day or two, tend to suffer some serious headaches. And so I think those are the things that in the correct, and the last thing is, of course, secondhand smoke. The tobacco companies are saying secondhand smoke is deadly. Well, there's so much evidence to the contrary there, but I would say that, for example, Richard Dahl, who was the man who first brought attention to a correlation between smoking and lung cancer, said about 10 years ago that the effects of secondhand smoke are so slight that they can't be measured and that they don't bother them. And even people in the anti-smoking movement now are acknowledging that there is no evidence, because secondhand smoke is so diluted, that it poses any harm to anybody, but it has been a very, very helpful tool in the war on smoking, because it's given the government the opportunity to go into private establishments, namely bars and restaurants and other places, and say, well, you can't have smokers in there. You have to eject the smokers if they're going to smoke. They can't be with other people. They will harm children, etc., etc. And so these corrective statements, I hope that I have in some way inspired someone to seriously question what is being broadcast on television, what will be in the radio, on the radio, and on in newspapers, because simply because the government coerces someone to say something doesn't mean that that's accurate. And I think it would raise one's skepticism meter. Thanks for watching the smoking section. Please watch us again next Wednesday. Good night.